Welcome to the ACIT Science Podcast, the official podcast of the Association for Critical and Interdisciplinary Thinking. We are a global nonprofit organization dedicated to spreading education around artificial intelligence, neuroscience, and social change. In this podcast, we are hoping to provide insightful discussions with young professionals and world-leading researchers alike. I'm your host, Manuel Brenner, and now without any further ado, let's jump right in. Hi everyone, I'm here with Lee Beck. Thanks a lot for joining us on the ACIT Science Podcast. So I will start with a short introduction of you and your background. You are currently director of the Global Carbon Capture Strategies for the Clean Air Task Force. And we've spoken about the Clean Air Task Force in our previous podcast with Armand Cohen already. So this is part 2 of our 3-part miniseries on the Clean Air Task Force and the work they are doing. But this episode, we are going to talk about your work more specifically, and in your capacity at the Clean Air Task Force, you lead the strategy program and team that is dealing with global carbon capture. And your team is by now represented in the US, in Europe, and the Middle East, and it's actually tripled in size in recent years. So this seems like a pretty exciting time for you and your work. And yeah, for people who haven't listened to our first episode, I can just recommend going to that and learning a bit more about the details of the Clean Air Task Force, what they are and what they do. But maybe it's still interesting to start with your perspective on how you ended up with the Clean Air Task Force.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here today. It's really great to have this conversation following your conversation with our founder and executive director, Armand Cohen. So I'm Lee. Obviously, I'm from Germany. I moved to the US 6 years ago, and I've been working on climate and innovation for multiple years before I was a journalist. And I've been working with the Clean Air Task Force actually for many years, and I was always really impressed by the organization's rigor, analytical fact-finding, and collaborative nature. So when my now colleagues approached me 2 years ago about joining, I was absolutely thrilled. Plus, being German and living in the United States, of course, for, as I said, 6 years, and being really passionate about the Transatlantic Alliance, I could not say no to the prospect about bringing Clean Air Task Force to Europe. And this has probably been the most exciting thing in my career, plus, of course, growing the carbon management team, which we're really, really excited about and seems to be taking off globally.
Yeah, nice. You previously to your work at the Clean Air Task Force worked for the Global CCS Institute, which is the Global Clean Carbon Capture and Storage Institute. So are there any similarities or differences in the approach between your previous work in the Clean Air Task Force, and are you still working with the Global CCS Institute?
The Global CCS Institute is really a global think tank backed by industry and governments, and also focused on deploying carbon capture and storage and direct air capture and storage technologies. I would say at Clean Air Task Force, our approach is a little bit different. We're really laser focused on driving what I call political, economic, climate policy change and policy innovation. So really, we're thinking deeply every day about how we can improve climate policies, make better climate policies, design new policies for new decarbonization technologies. Clean Air Task Force is also, of course, much larger, and we're focused on multiple different technologies and how they work together to enable systems change. And, working on carbon management technologies, for us, it's really not so much about pushing specific or imposing specific technology solutions, but to create a portfolio of technology options. We call this the principle of optionality, and it's really about reducing risks, because the more policy options we have, or the more technology options we have, the lesser the risk of any of these technology options failing. And so 75% of emissions reductions are actually expected to come from technologies that are not yet mature. And at the Clean Air Task Force, we work on many of them and how they interact within a decarbonization system. That being said, we, of course, I mentioned we're very collaborative in nature, so we, of course, still work with the Global CCS Institute on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. So you mentioned technological solutions. I think there's a lot of details we can go into, but before that, maybe we can also still quickly talk about your background and how you can actually, it seems like a very collaborative endeavor. You have people with an engineering background and a background in public policy, and if I remember correctly, you come from a public policy background, so you already studied in that direction. So what kind of skill set is useful, or what's kind of your academic skill set that allowed you to transition into these jobs?
I mean, I think to start here, climate change really is one of the most complex issues that humanity has ever faced. So to really address that multifaceted nature, we need to be able to analyze this from multiple different angles. So that's where Clean Air Task Force is strong. The beauty of the Clean Air Task Force team is really its diversity and skill set. We have lawyers, economists, political scientists, climate modelers, data experts, just as a few examples. And that really helps us to look at solutions in a non-conventional nature and look at a variety of different perspectives. Personally, I think, because we're so focused on policy, I think my policy background comes in handy. But to be honest, a lot of the solutions that we're working on are so innovative that, they're not that many textbooks about or courses at university about them yet. So I think being curious and being open to learning from experts, from academia, from other innovators is really key at the Clean Air Task Force.
So is your work mostly focused on, like, what is your work mostly focused, like managing people or like reading about new technologies, or all at the same time?
Yeah, all at the same time. Of course, running a program that has more than 10 different experts means managing, but of course also making strategy, ensuring we're at the pulse of global climate policy making, but also at the pulse of where the industry is with deploying the technologies, where innovators are with new technologies, where R&D is at. So I think a lot of different pieces come together, and we also, of course, want our experts to be versed in all of these aspects. So it's really exciting to work at Clean Air Task Force because, of course, you get to do the work, but you also get to learn every single day from your colleagues.
So yeah, now maybe we should define what carbon capture actually is. And you managed a lot of savings are going to be expected to come from new technologies, but in a different light, carbon capture is already a technology that has been around for many decades. And we can start with a very general framework of what it is, what it constitutes, and what the technological state of the art currently is, and what kind of developments we can expect in the future.
So carbon management technologies, as I've been calling them, that really includes carbon capture and storage, carbon capture, transport and storage, direct air capture and storage. So it's really a suite of decarbonization technologies. And usually we like to break them up. So they're the capture components that separate the CO2 at the source. So for example, at a cement or steel production facility, or directly from the air. Then there's the transport component. So CO2 can be transported to the geologic storage site via pipeline. There are projects that are using ships to transport the CO2. Rail is another example. And then, of course, there's the geologic storage of CO2, which is really where the climate benefit happens or is realized. And this happens at dedicated geologic storage sites, multiple kilometers under the surface in porous rock. It's widely known, it's safe, and the great thing about it is there's hundreds of years of current emissions levels of storage available globally.
So basically, the storage component will never run us into problems like in the near future.
In the near future, absolutely not.
And then up until that point, we will probably have enough renewables. But yeah, talking about what the actual problems are, maybe as a general question, how much carbon can we actually expect to save? So, I mean, the carbon capture only kicks in for energies that release carbon sources, so fossil fuels, oil and coal, for example. So how much can we actually expect to save if the technology is employed on a larger scale? Or what other sectors, apart from fossil fuel, that are also related to places where we can actually also use the technology?
So I would like to cite the International Energy Agency's net zero scenario here that shows that we need to store some 7.6 gigatons of CO2 annually by 2050. So 7.6 gigatons is 7 0.6 billion tons of CO2. So if you think about it, an average carbon capture facility captures between 1 and 5 million tons annually, captures and stores. And this is even in a world where we're not investing in additional expansion of fossil fuel production and also dramatically reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. So in this scenario, carbon capture and storage is really about transforming existing assets that have already locked in emissions. So if you think about industrial assets that have decades of lifespan left, 95% of our carbon budget is actually already locked into existing assets. So that could be carbon capture for cement, which is 8% of global emissions, and where carbon capture and storage is really the only solution to fully decarbonize the sector. That could be carbon capture on steel facilities, which make another 4% of global emissions. This also is for power in the power sector. For remaining assets, coal and gas plants, especially in emerging markets. And then, of course, negative emissions, so direct air capture and bioenergy carbon capture and storage. So you can see there's really a diversity of applications. And while we're seeing about 150 carbon capture and storage and direct air capture and storage projects in planning across the U.S. and Europe right now, we're really looking to the U.S. and Europe to help build this first wave of projects, help commercialize the projects, so then we can deliver a global rollout.
Yeah, I think that nicely connects to a point that Armin also made about, I guess, the importance of optionality also comes in when you realize that not all of the CO2 emissions really can be gotten rid of. And people usually think of the energy sector and us just moving to solar. But if you want to continue building homes, and then you just need to use cement and you still need steel. And it's really seems unavoidable in the near future to get rid of CO2. So I guess it's one of the motivations why you are actually looking at carbon capture, because really there seems to be no way around that. Is it a correct way of framing it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we also don't just want to continue building these things. We also need steel for the energy transition for windmills. We also need hydrogen as a zero carbon fuel in the future. And one way to produce it is with carbon capture and storage. So it's really one of these building blocks for a decarbonized energy system. And I think, we should always think about the effectiveness and fairness of certain paradigms that create path or technology dependence. From Clean Air Task Force's perspective, we work on these different technologies because we think that each country or region should really be able to decarbonize with a technology portfolio that is tailored to its local political, economic, and research circumstances. So Germany, for example, Germany's energy transition might look very differently and require different technologies than that of Poland. In California, energy transition might look different than that from Texas, and that is completely legitimate and completely supported. So that's from our perspective why we need to commercialize all technologies, whether we like them or not. This shouldn't be an ideological question. And so that's why we also urge policymakers to face these different realities, these different technology portfolio requirements, and factor this into the climate policy making.
Yeah, carbon capture has been around for quite some time, but it's not very widely used yet. So I think this is partly because there's this, I think, assumption that it's not really a very efficient technology. So maybe we can talk about the efficiency of carbon capture and what kind of the issues have been for the last decades to kind of stand in the way of it being adopted more widely.
I think many people always say that, oh, the technology doesn't work, but really it's a policy and regulatory issue. And it's a little bit complex. So pardon me if my answer is a little bit long, but I do want to go into the details that I think are relevant.
Yeah, please.
So the technologies, as you said, have been around for decades. There's more than 27 carbon capture facilities at scale, so capturing multiple 100,000 and upwards tons every year. So storing close to 40 million tons every year. So the reason why the technology hasn't taken off or hasn't been widely deployed is yet that obviously carbon capture and storage technologies are solely emissions reductions technologies, and they come at a cost. So if you're a polluter, and many of them are not even exposed to carbon pricing, why should you deploy a technology that costs you money if you're not required to do so by regulation or incentivized to do so by high carbon pricing? So there's really, in the absence of policy, no investment case unless policy creates it. The second is, a decade ago, industrial decarbonization was a huge climate blind spot, and the need for negative emissions wasn't even on government's radar. So the first attempt to scale these technologies about a decade ago really came with a focus on these huge multi-million ton coal power plants that were the most difficult and most expensive to develop. And back then, the incentive structures were also not as mature. Innovation policy wasn't as developed as today. And so these inadequate incentive structures, with the rise of gas, of course, had many of these projects fail. And so luckily, there's really been a change over the past couple of years. I would really say since 2018, since the IPCC's landmark report that showed, all solutions must be on the table, including industrial decarbonization, including carbon capture and storage. And so in the US and Europe, we're looking at a much more strategic policy approach coupled with a much more certain climate policy environment. So these two factors really spell out a much more promising path towards commercialization. And we should also, I think one important aspect is, we should also not forget that by commercializing the technology, which really means we're reducing the cost, we're providing learning by doing, we're providing the necessary CO2 transport and storage infrastructure, we're enabling standardization, we're making it easier for companies to deploy these technologies, which means we're creating buy-in from the private sector for more aggressive climate policies, because now companies can actually comply with tougher regulation or more ambitious climate policies. So I know this was kind of a drawn-out answer, but there's so many headlines just saying, "Oh, carbon capture doesn't work." I just don't think that does justice to the complexity of technology innovation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, you mentioned incentives and that incentives have changed. So, if we just imagine like a company today that is working, for example, I just read something on the webpage of Heidelberg Cement that they are building a huge a carbon capture facility in Norway. So what are the main incentives for companies to adopt these policies? Is it the increasing CO2 prices, or is it kind of they are trying to change their image mainly, or is it a mix of all of these things?
Yeah, I mean, it's really a mix of all of these things. I think the US has a very sophisticated policy framework now for carbon capture and storage, where you get paid a tax credit per ton of CO2 stored. So it's really an inverted price on carbon. There is grants that provide incentives for building CO2 open access CO2 transport and storage, for commercializing geologic storage. So really, there's different policy pieces that you can pick and choose from to decarbonize your assets. In Europe, there's been also a large comeback on carbon capture and storage. So 4 of 7 of the projects that were just incentivized under the first call of the Innovation Fund were carbon capture and storage projects. There was a proposed sustainable carbon cycles communication to incentivize and create markets for carbon dioxide removal. There's the new 10E, which includes CO2 transport and storage. There's national level incentives across the block. So there's really, again, a lot of different incentives that companies can pick and choose from. That being said, I think first movers that we're seeing, like you were mentioning, Heidelberg Cement, I think they're really incentivized by hoping to gain an advantage in the market through decarbonization, because I think it has become crystal clear we are moving to a net zero world, and the sooner you can adapt, the better you're positioned in competitive markets like this. And of course, like, incentives will evaporate as technologies commercializes. So I think, some of these companies realize they should take these incentives today to future-proof their business, to future-proof the jobs they're creating, to to really help innovate and help commercialize these technologies rather than wait and then have not enough time to really change their business in a sustainable way.
So maybe we can go back to the technological questions, actually. So now that carbon capture is being more widely deployed, is there still kind of a lot of innovation happening, or is it mostly the adoption of pre-existing technologies at this point? Or like, are you also looking at new generation technologies that will really revolutionize in the same way that with solar and wind, you had this extreme drop of prices as soon as the incentive structure was kind of properly in place?
I mean, carbon capture and storage are big infrastructure projects, right? So there will always a cost. That being said, I think we're seeing both technological improvements through R&D, and of course, business model and infrastructure improvements. And if I'm looking, you mentioned solar. 90% of the cost reductions for solar, for example, were actually harvested through incentives by the German government. The German government single-handedly helped commercialize solar, enabling learning by doing, and really only 10% was more focused on, or 10% of cost reductions were delivered by R&D. So from our perspective, it's really important to deploy these technologies today so we can have viable business models. We can create shared infrastructure, which will lead to economies of scale. And then, of course, we also want to have technologies that revolutionize processes and systems. But there's the carbon capture and storage that is used to abate existing assets, so you're retrofitting them. Then there is direct air capture, where you're building facilities to filter CO2 out of the air. And then, of course, there are technologies like, for example, the net power projects, or the alum cycle, it's called, where we're inventing how we're producing electricity with natural gas while capturing the carbon. So there's really a lot of innovation happening throughout the entire value chain of carbon management technologies.
So yeah, carbon capture also aims at not only reduction of emission, but also the induction of negative emissions. So the idea that you can actually try to get carbon out of the atmosphere. So as far as I understood it, this is mainly only like done in pilot projects, and it doesn't really work up to scale to really significantly lower the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. So what is kind of the state of technology on that front, and are you actually personally expecting there to be like big shifts or big developments in that direction that could impact climate change on a larger scale?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from our perspective, we're of course excited about negative emissions technologies, but they're not a get out of jail free card for industrial transformation. So existing assets need to be abated through fuel switching, electrification, carbon capture and storage, all the solutions we have. And then, of course, it's becoming very clear that there's some sectors we might never be able to fully abate, or sectors where we need to create fuels for which direct air capture technologies could be really helpful. So right now, there's really three main providers in this space. There's, of course, Climeworks, which has the Orca plant in Iceland that made a lot of headlines. There's Carbon Engineering, which is aiming to build a a megaton scale facility in Texas. And there's also Global Thermostat. But what I think is really exciting about the negative emissions technology space is that there's been recently really a lot of different technologies entering the market, a lot of VC venture capital flowing into these technologies, particularly in the United States. So it's becoming really exciting to see how this sector is flourishing, and that's really the kind of innovation that climate needs.
And again, talking about incentives, the venture capital is flowing in because people are actually expecting this to be a profitable environment, because governments are increasingly interested in paying money or investing a lot of money in these potential technologies.
Yeah, there is. I think there is really not just governments, of course, government procurement of negative emissions. These are ideas that are being looked at in the United States, for example. There are also voluntary carbon markets that are taking off, and there's also, of course, this notion that offsets, that not all offsets are equal, and that permanent carbon removal will really be required. So that's why there's a lot of interest in developing new technologies with the hopes that this can, of course, become a profitable market.
Maybe going back to the policy layer or these political questions. So you mentioned 2018 as kind of a shifting point, I think, when things took off. Was there any specific events, or is it kind of the spirit of the time just shifting, or were it specific governments?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I said, there was the release of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's landmark 1.5 degree report, which showed that all technologies must be on the table. That was also the year that multiple governments presented their net zero strategies. So, for example, the EU released a Clean Planet for All, its long-term strategy for a climate neutral Europe. And that's really when the carbon management technologies were brought back onto the agenda, acknowledging that all technologies are needed. In 2019, the UK Climate Committee on Climate Change followed suit and said carbon capture and storage is a necessity, not an option. So I think it became, with rising climate ambition, it became very much clear to deliver on this ambition with climate action, we will need multiple technologies. And then, of course, in 2018, there was also the reform of the 45Q tax credit in the United States, which I explained earlier is probably the most significant technology-specific incentive. It was increased to $50 a ton of CO2. So there was just a lot of kind of pieces of the puzzle falling into place. And then more and more facilities were announced as a result, up to more than 150 across the US and Europe alone.
So it seems somewhat surprising that this also happened during the Trump administration, because I think that the general image was that the Trump administration really was fighting back on a lot of the positive developments in the climate sector. So do you think there's kind of what Armand Cohen also already mentioned, is that things seem to be like everyone seems to be going kind of in the same direction now in the US as well, and that there's not too much polarization around climate change anymore because everyone has realized basically that something needs to be done. Do you share that assessment?
Yeah, I definitely share that assessment. And I mean, carbon capture and storage technologies are really unique in the sense that they have really broad, particularly in the United States, really broad support. So there's support from environmental organizations like Cleaner Task Force or the Nature Conservancy and the National Wildlife Federation. There's support from big energy companies, industrial companies, and then, of course, from labor unions, because it's really about transforming, future-proofing industrial assets, safeguarding thousands of jobs in the United States in natural resource production, in energy-intensive industries, and so that leads to really bipartisan support, both from Democrats and Republicans, as one of the viable solutions for climate. And so, yeah, I definitely share Armin's assessment, but I also think that carbon management technologies are in a unique spot because they're so multifaceted and so diverse in nature for decarbonization that they enjoy this kind of broad support across the aisle.
So I'm just in my own head trying to wrap my head around kind of the causality of what was happening in the last couple of years, because you had these big youth movements and a lot of kind of there being this increasing identity movement around climate change, and especially in the young generation. In Germany, for example, in the student generation, there's a very urgent sense of everyone caring about the climate by now. And do you think this adoption has also to do with this increasing pressure kind of from like broader swaths of their society, or is it more kind of that these technological developments have encouraged governments to go in this direction?
Yeah, I think it's a multitude of factors. I think um, that all the attention on increasing climate ambition and really the importance of carbon management rises with climate ambition because it is for these harder to decarbonize sectors, right? So it is really the innovation required to get us to the net to the 100% for the net in net zero. And so I think this increased attention on increased climate ambition led governments to realize that, okay, if we really want to transform, we need to invest in these technologies today. And companies also, of course, saw their license to operate under threat. And as I said earlier, realized that they can take the incentives now to transform their business, or they might lose their social license to operate, or it will be much more expensive to transform. And again, like especially carbon capture and storage technologies are complex technologies. A geologic storage site can take a decade to develop. Some of these projects takes 4 to 6 years to develop, right? So it's really about making sure we're investing today to have the technologies commercialized in time. So it's really this like impulse today that between now and 2030, we really have to completely change how we approach climate policy making. And so I think all of these different factors that you mentioned were really helpful to wake up policymakers and the public that systemic transformation requires us to also take no technologies off the table.
And yeah, do you have kind of a sense of optimism by now if you look at the developments of recent months? I think there's still this idea that governments are still not doing enough, and not enough is being done, and it's more a bit like when for example CO2 emissions like trading, or there started to be a market for that, and it really didn't work too well in the last couple of years or decades. Do you think now there's really the shift is substantial enough that it will actually make a difference, or is there still more need for more action?
I mean, it really depends on the country and the government that we're looking at and the political economic environment that we're operating in, right? Certainly, the EU has taken a whole of government approach to climate, and that is very successful. That has led to innovative ideas like the sustainable finance taxonomy that are really contributing to the blue book or the inventory of global climate policies. I think the other thing is really that climate policy isn't one and done, right? So we always need to keep in mind that what we really need is we need to start somewhere. We need to start with clear targets, which we have, and then we need to walk backwards to understand which technologies we need, what kind of infrastructure do we need to decarbonize. We need to understand that today, and then we need to plan and build it, really. But that also requires us to every 2 years, I would say, like the German government did with the EEG, go back to the drawing board and say, okay, are these policies working? Are they not working? Do we have to tweak them or make them more competitive, change their framework to make them more effective to really deploy these technologies? And I think so. It's really, I think governments could always be doing enough is the short answer. But I think we're already getting into a kind of new paradigm of climate policy making.
And that seems to induce some optimism, at least.
Yeah.
That's how it feels like to me. Maybe we can at this point talk a bit more about like more concrete projects that you are following, or the policy programs that the Clean Air Task Force is pursuing in the US and in Europe. So in the US, you have these federal incentives, and in Europe, you have the European CC removal and storage strategy, where we can take them one by one.
Yeah. So I think we already talked a little bit earlier, but we can go into more details. So in the US, U.S. government has done more than any other government in the world to commercialize carbon capture and storage technologies. So I talked about the 45Q tax credit that was introduced first in 2010 at $20 a ton. Then it was increased in 2018 to $50 a ton. And this is really an inverted price on carbon. And now the government is actually discussing bringing it up to $85 a ton for industrial and power facilities and $180 a ton for direct air capture facilities. So this is really a game changer, really high value on carbon to commercialize. So this is what emitters could get to transform their assets. Analysis that we have commissioned actually shows that an $85 an $85 45Q tax credit could unlock an additional 100 million tons of CO2 emissions reductions at cement and steel facilities in the United States. This is coupled, which I said, with $12 billion of infrastructure funding for CO2 transport and storage that was passed as part of Biden's big infrastructure bill during the Conference of the Parties last year. There was additional $8 billion in hydrogen funding, hydrogen hubs funding, which could all be combined to really deliver these energy systems or this kind of carbon management vision of an interconnected system of industrial facilities capturing their carbon, producing hydrogen, delivering negative emissions, and feeding it into kind of shared CO2 transport and storage infrastructure. In Europe, we're not as kind of advanced from a policy perspective. There is funding available for facilities, but it's more reminiscent of demonstration funding. So we're kind of building the first of a kind, the first wave. In Europe, there's currently 2 operating carbon capture facilities. In the U.S., there's 12 operating carbon capture facilities. So the U.S. already has built kind of the first 12 carbon capture, the first wave. And so in Europe, we're just getting at that. But now what Clean Air Task Force is working on is in Europe is really working towards a carbon capture and storage strategy for Europe that clarifies how we're going to incentivize the per ton reduction of carbon capture and storage technologies. So one example is we're working towards carbon contracts for differences as part of the European emissions trading system that's on the table right now. Another aspect is where we want separate funding for CO2 storage and transport. We want clear targets of how much CO2 we're trying to store. So we really want a comprehensive legislative review on the EU level to see what gaps are there in the policy frameworks and how can we fill it.
So maybe, quickly, one point that you mentioned several times, that you can actually combine carbon capture with getting H2, like hydrogen, for the additional use as a fuel. So maybe quickly going to the chemical side of things or the technological side, why are these two things connected?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's different ways of producing hydrogen. There's kind of different color codes. There's green hydrogen produced from renewable electricity, and there's blue hydrogen produced from carbon capture, produced from natural gas with carbon capture and storage and upstream methane controls. So from our perspective, we really need to make sure that we're commercializing both of these approaches because, of course, we need renewable electricity also to decarbonize the grid. So each kind of hydrogen that we're producing or each piece of renewables that we're deploying to produce hydrogen should really be additional. That's called additionality. And so to really unlock this kind of large scale hydrogen market today, it would be helpful to produce hydrogen from natural gas with carbon capture and storage and upstream methane controls to really have large amounts of cheap hydrogen available, but also commercialize carbon capture and storage technologies. So that's kind of how we're looking at it. All options, again, must be on the table, but we really need to ensure that we have sufficient low carbon hydrogen production capabilities available to deliver on decarbonization goals.
Yeah, so a ballpark figure I read on several sources is that carbon capture can actually increase the energy use of a power plant, for example, by up to 40%. So this was cited as one of the reasons why carbon capture hasn't been adopted too widely, but could make actually making use of the hydrogen then reduce that energy cost again, because you can make use of the energy in that hydrogen again. Or maybe more generally, do you think this number of 40% increased energy use is actually a big hurdle still, or can newer technologies get around that a bit?
This what you're alluding to is the idea of parasitic load, that you're of course reducing the efficiency of a power plant because you have to run the capture equipment. I mean, again, this depends on the technology, depends on the application, the kind of power plant, but certainly there is trade-offs. There is parasitic load at these facilities.
Yeah, one of the reasons I read that this might kind of make carbon capture a bit inefficient in the energy sector is that then the parasitic load is large enough so it can't actually compete anymore with wind and solar, or maybe nuclear, depending whether that's an option in the region. So do you think that's kind of true, and carbon capture based on that makes more sense in kind of industries where you really can't get rid or find alternative ways of acting without producing any CO2?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should definitely commercialize carbon capture and storage technologies for all these industries, for power sector, for industries to make it available. Um, and then, of course, I mean, I think it depends on the specific location, on the specific plant, whether carbon capture and storage makes sense in that regard. But I will also say that, you know, from a cost perspective, there's different ways of looking at it. So, of course, you know, if you're having a high penetration renewable energy grid and then you provide clean, firm power, that power plant that has been retrofitted with CCS provides a much different value to the grid in terms of keeping um, overall costs lower by being able to be dispatchable than if you're just looking at a per kilowatt hour basis or an LCOE basis. So I think people like to paint this as a very black and white issue and a very straightforward kind of question, but really even power sector decarbonization is very complex, and we shouldn't, before we have even reached, you know, higher levels of decarbonization, write off any solutions.
Yeah, I guess that connects to the issue Armand also talked about, with wind and solar being very seasonal and dependent on kind of, yeah, also a bit of luck. I think we saw this in Europe already now in the coming winter, where we had periods where the wind wasn't blowing, and then suddenly you have much larger pressure on the facilities that don't really depend on the seasons. And now we are lucky to have a mild winter and a lot of sun these recent weeks that make us a bit more independent of Russian oil. I think it always kind of, yeah, depends on the current weather, and that shouldn't be yeah, that can make it a bit tricky to compute through, like the logic of how the power grid should be, yeah, structured. Yeah, so maybe going back to the, yeah, policy programs and maybe your project in Europe. And I saw on your website you have this map, like this interactive map of your projects that you're doing in Europe. So maybe we can also go a bit into detail what kind of projects you're doing there specifically, and, yeah, what kind of the state of affairs is.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for referencing our map. It's actually one of the most visited parts of this CATF website because it really is an up to date tracker of all the facilities that have been announced or under development in the U.S., Europe, and soon the Middle East. And so, what we're really seeing in Europe is many facilities in the industrial sector, many different kind of approaches to carbon capture and storage technologies. So different applications, so cement, waste to energy, hydrogen production, but then also more countries are interested in deploying the technologies. So we've seen carbon capture and storage facilities announced in Poland, in France, in Greece, countries that have not traditionally been first movers, such as, for example, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, the UK. So there's really a lot of interest in and new actors in this space. And then we're also seeing that a lot of these facilities will share infrastructure and storage sites. I think two really important examples are of first mover projects is the Port of Rotterdam project and the Northern Lights projects, which are going to start storing CO2 from initial anchor facilities, but are ready to be expanded to take in CO2 from additional industrial facilities. So that's what I call the multiplier effect of first mover supersized infrastructure. If we're adding the capacity and we're making available CO2 storage as a service, more industrial emitters will follow suit and will be encouraged to feed into this existing infrastructure. Because, again, as I said, it's really complex to deploy these technologies. If you're producing cement, you're not an expert in CO2 capture technology. You're not an expert in CO2 transport or pipelines. You're not an expert in subsurface geology. So what we're seeing in Europe is really these different parts of the value chain being decoupled, reducing cross-chain risk with different parties being able to focus on the parts that they're experts in. So Northern Lights is an open source CO2 storage hub. So they're taking in CO2 as a service while helping with the retrofitting. There's new companies being built in that provide support for developing these projects, that provide support for financing. So it's really, really exciting how this kind of renewed focus on carbon capture and storage technologies, coupled with political support and policy incentives, have unlocked this entirely new industry.
So, what kind of a structure are we going to expect? So, is how expensive is kind of the transport component and the storage component? Or is it feasible that there will be these huge storage sites, and then just countries ship their CO2 to these specific facilities, or is it going to be more like every facility has their own capture and then also storage in the nearby area?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if we're looking at the United States, these first 12 facilities are really capture, single source, single sink. And what we're hoping the next wave of carbon capture and storage projects will be is really multiple sources capturing their carbon, feeding into shared infrastructure and storage. That will achieve economies of scale, as I said, and that's what we're also seeing in in Europe being developed. So the cost is really, again, it depends on how far are you away from CO2 storage. If you're right above it, it can be very cheap. If you're further away to transport the CO2, it becomes more expensive. Are you transporting the CO2 by pipeline, or are you transporting it by ship, right? So I think there's not a one size fits all figure, but probably I think the first facilities in Europe are going to be incentivized at upwards of 100 euros a ton of CO2 reduced. That being said, I think there's a few more, there's a really important case to make for dedicated per ton of CO2 funding mechanisms, such as carbon contracts for differences, and dedicated support for geologic storage. Analysis that Clean Air Task Force has commissioned shows that if we don't make available more technology-specific funding, we might face a 10 billion euro funding gap by 2030 for carbon capture and storage technologies. And if we don't invest in the characterization and development of CO2 storage today, by 2030 we will face a 30% storage gap because we just didn't, start early enough to develop this kind of CO2 storage. So it's really, the clock is ticking for us to put in place these policies. So then we're unlocking this business and industrial activity to create this industry.
So that's basically where you see your job as a clean air task force in a way to already see the trend a bit in advance and kind of try to get policies in the right direction so you don't suddenly end up with too much CO2 and too little storage capacities.
Yeah, absolutely. We're always working on passing one package and already working on the tweaks and next generation of the next policy package. So right now we're looking at what additional incentives are needed, what tweaks are necessary potentially in the United States. In Europe, we have a forthcoming flagship report about what a carbon capture and storage technology could carbon capture and storage strategy could look like for Europe, with very concrete policy recommendations that not just go into incentive structures, but also what could a market for geologic storage globally look like? What could a market for CO2 procurement look like? So we're always kind of trying to anticipate and agenda set the next generation of policies.
So far we've mainly talked about carbon capture necessarily implies CO2 and carbon, but there are also other forms of emission. You mentioned methane at one point. Are there also solutions for other potentially harmful gases like methane? I know the Clean Air Task Force has also worked a lot on methane leaks and these kind of things too. Are these technologies also like more widely sensible?
Yeah, I mean, I think, methane is the largest program at Clean Air Task Force, or the super pollutants team. Their campaign, Cut Methane EU, as well as the Global Methane Pledge, leading up to the Global Methane Pledge, has been hugely successful. And really, targeting methane emissions today is the single most important step we can do to shave off global warming. So I would urge all of our listeners to check out Clean Air Task Force's work on methane and to bring the methane team on your show.
Yeah, that's actually a very good idea. I will reach out to them. Yeah, so I guess with your specific background, you have worked in the US and Europe and worked on clean energy and climate policy on both sides of the Atlantic. So maybe as a more of a meta question, what have you kind of learned from the differences in how Europeans versus Americans approach policy and just approach everything? Do you think that both sides can kind of learn something from each other?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's actually extremely complementary. So I told you earlier that the IEA has shown that some 75% of emissions reductions are expected to come from technologies that are not yet mature. So I think we really have to reckon that to decarbonize completely, we need both comprehensive climate policies like carbon pricing or clean energy standards, but we also need these technology-specific innovation policies that we've been discussing today that focuses on deploying technologies at scale, reducing their costs, enabling learning by doing, basically everything that the German feed-in tariff has done for solar. And so Europe has comprehensive climate policy and regulation. It's really taking this step-by-step approach to align all its policy with its climate goals. But that being said, a lot of what's happening in Europe right now is very much focused on existing technologies rather than, as I said, deploying the next generation of technologies or innovations. So, however, some of the regulations like the ETS could be made much more stringent. For example, by phasing out the free allocations, huge topic in Brussels right now. If there was a more strategic approach to focus on innovation and deployment and using these really as incentives for companies to agree to higher ambition or much more ambitious decarbonization policy. And we also shouldn't forget that, Europe is the birthplace of technology commercialization with what Germany has done for solar or Denmark has done for offshore wind. But if we're going to the US, then there's obviously no comprehensive climate policy because that, both parties haven't been able to agree on. So technology-specific innovation policies like tax credits for solar, for wind, for carbon capture and storage, hydrogen productions, nuclear, and grants for infrastructure demonstration projects are filling this climate policy gap. That's, of course, super awesome news for global decarbonization, that the US is willing to pay its fair share for decarbonization technology. But without this kind of more comprehensive climate policy that Europe has with the ETS, there will never be this clear signal for decarbonization, because I think the private sector will, or some parts of the private sector will always try to buy more time and undermine this more higher climate ambition. So I think there's it's a very complementary approach that both sides can learn from each other. So in Europe, we want to see more innovation, technology specific innovation policy to boost and bolster comprehensive climate policy. And in the US, we want to see comprehensive climate policy to really make sure that more parties are agreeing to more incentives and are using these incentives to really transform the economy.
Yeah, it sounds like the old, the big difference between the US political philosophy of kind of the state not being too involved and the market kind of having to regulate itself, and in Europe it being this top-down approach to policy that the state is really taking action. And I don't know, it seems like climate change tends to be like a famous or like a popular example of a place where the market doesn't really regulate itself too well, because you need to have the incentives from the policy layer. But as it sounds like in the US, it also could potentially lead to a bit more innovation, or like maybe the American spirit of innovation from the private sector can come in a bit handy here.
Yeah, I mean, I think, of course, the spirit, as you said, come in handy. You know, there might be much more appetite for risk for innovative financial products in this space. But I do want to, just say that about Europe, there's this very clear commitment to climate neutrality, and there's this incredible willingness to rewrite the rules of the game to really have new policies on the table, innovative policies, and provide, honestly, a stress test for the Paris Agreement.
Do you see any country or like any party specifically pushing that? And maybe, I know you're also from Germany, so is there like the recent change in government in Germany, has that also had an effect on how things are going? Because now we have the Green Party actually in the government directly.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, I think the coalition agreement was very promising. It had a nod to CO2 storage via referencing the need for negative emissions. It talked about blue hydrogen, industrial decarbonization. So it really went beyond this, renewables focused narrative that has been dominant in Germany for so long. That being said, we need to, now Clean Air Task Force's job by expanding into Germany will be to hold policymakers accountable to that treaty, to what science is telling us, which technologies we need, and really work with the government to really develop key strategies to advance different technologies. So I think there's certainly lots of positive impulses, but more needs to be done to deliver on climate ambition.
So you don't have an office in, also the Clean Air Task Force recently expanded into Europe, basically.
Yeah. So I think Clean Air Task Force has been working in Europe for a long time, but we never had a formalized presence until the mid 2020, when we started the zero carbon fuels program and the methane program, and shortly after added a European carbon management team to it. And since then, we have been looking at, expanding our presence in those economies that we think are most critical for climate and where there's the most opportunity for change. So one example is Germany, another one is the UK.
And was it probably also related to the big funding boost through the effective altruism endorsement that you had the opportunity to grow and expand?
Yeah, absolutely. We're growing. We're adding new funders, new foundations, new team members. So that's all really, really exciting, because I think Clean Air Task Force offers a pragmatic approach to climate policy making, and potentially also new angles as an innovation-focused environmental organization. So it's really exciting to grow and see our impact daily.
Yeah, maybe this is a nice way to connect to the kind of more meta questions. I think that the first one I wanted to talk about was more general or useful ways for people and our listeners to get active in battling climate change, because I feel like, especially in my generation, there's this big desire to do something and to get to meaningful actions, but it's a bit hard to navigate that space. And like, should I eat vegetarian or stop flying or don't get a car, or are there any other ways? And I think kind of the mentality behind effective altruism already is focused on this thought of effectiveness. And I think the Clean Air Task Force really nicely translates this as well, in like looking for the place where you can get the most bang for your buck, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's funny because recently the Tagesspiegel in Berlin asked me a question. Oh, which, if you had to like choose one flight that you could never not have, or not, one flight connection that you could never miss, what would it be? And I said, well, isn't the solution to find new ways of flying, decarbonize flying, making flying net zero compatible? And so I think that's really the spirit that I would recommend to people is, make your voices heard with policymakers, not just in service of ratcheting climate ambition, but also climate action and taking key steps to implement solutions. Educate yourself on the climate solutions portfolio that we need that for a globally just energy transition. Of course, you should look at implementing solar at home and switching to an EV. Of course, all these things are really important, but I think really understanding that and getting to the gist of the different technologies that is needed is really important. And then, of course, there's other ways of supporting climate action, that is donating to climate change organizations that are working on climate policy. Clean Air Task Force is one example, of course. There's more super highly rated organizations. So I think this is really, really important to understand that, of course, behavioral changes are important, but we also need to make sure that we're demanding transformational investments that safeguard jobs, that safeguard communities from our governments.
Like, connecting to your first point, I'm a bit curious. Do you think there's a feasible way to decarbonize also flying and aircrafts?
Yeah, I mean, there's already multiple policy efforts underway for sustainable aviation fuel. One way a sustainable aviation fuel can be created is through capturing CO2 from the air and using that in the fuels. There's also hydrogen planes underway. So I think there's a lot of innovation still coming over the next decades. Until then, of course, I think permanent carbon removal will be one way to permanently offset this sector, which of course accounts for 5% of global emissions. But I will also say that, this wouldn't be the first time we completely reinvented planes or the way we fly. So, right, I think I was talking to a friend of mine who's a former Navy pilot, and she was saying, well, we just need to invent new planes that fly with clean fuels. And it's not like we haven't invented new planes before, or new engines before. So I think she's really right. And I really embrace her optimism.
Nice. Yeah. Optimism is always like a good thing to hear in that climate questions, because I think a lot of people are also pretty pessimistic these days. Yeah, maybe also on a more personal level, do you have any favorite books or articles that influenced your thinking in the past? Maybe like also on climate questions that maybe even back in the day shaped your path to go into the climate sector?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one will actually be quite interesting for those questions about how do we decarbonize planes, and that is Bill Gates, which he recently only released this book, but How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. It really talks a lot about the solutions that Clean Air Task Force works on: hydrogen, carbon management technologies, decarbonizing heavy industries, direct air capture. So I think that one is a really good book to inform yourself about these kind of more innovative technologies. And then on a personal level, I really like books that look at the climate crisis from an intertemporal perspective and that connect this climate disaster with other degrees of the effect, like the second and third order effects of climate change, including societal and political economic change. So examples are, for example, Geoengineering, Climate Tragedy, Repair and Restoration by Holly Jean Buck, and all the books from Maya Lunde, which I think are actually very popular here in Germany.
I think this was a really, really interesting conversation. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say, any interesting points you wanted to bring up.
Yeah, thank you. I think we covered everything. We went in depth into carbon management technologies, how to deploy them, the policy incentives, what's happening in the EU, the US, what's happening in the private sector. So I think we covered a lot of ground. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today and talk with my colleagues at the Clean Air Task Force about the different technologies we're working on.
Yeah, it's really exciting stuff. And so thank you for your work and for taking the time.